What's up everyone, Subterranean here, and today we're going to learn how to make this bass. You might have heard basses similar to this in many dubstep and trap songs, especially songs in the more recent hybrid trap subgenre. It's been used by artists like Snails and a few others. So we're going to start by initializing the preset in Serum. And let's get rid of these external effects for now. We won't be using these until much later on. We're going to start with our first oscillator, and our first wavetable is actually going to be a custom wavetable that I made myself by taking a pre-existing bass I already made and importing it back into Serum. In the description box, we'll have a download link where you can get the wavetable along with instructions if you don't know how to install it. We'll also have a download link for the full Ableton project file. So this is what we have so far. I like it on the default wavetable position. Let's take an LFO1 and drag it onto the wavetable position and see what we get. I like it on 64. For our LFO1, we're going to take the rate and decrease it to 1 bar, and we're going to set it to trigger mode. Now let's take LFO1 and make a different kind of curve with the shape. We're going to take these little knobs and adjust them so we have a curve that looks a little bit more like this. Nice. Now we're going to take a bend plus and minus from the warp mode, and let's see if we get a good sound out of it. I like it on about 30. Now let's take an LFO1, and we'll modulate it by about 21. Let's turn down our master because we're going to be doing some very heavy effects processing and we don't want this bass to clip. Now let's fire up Oscillator 2, and we'll be using a Squelchy 1 wavetable which is under the Spectrum category. Let's play around with the wavetable position and see if we find a good sound here. I like it on about 93. Now let's take our LFO1 and apply it to the wavetable position. I actually like it on the default. We're not going to change that, on about 64. Now let's take a bend plus and minus and apply it to our second oscillator. It sounds good on 8. And now we'll modulate it by about 27. Now let's fire up our filter, and we'll set it to be an HP12, which is under the multi category, and we'll take our LFO1 and modulate the cutoff with it. Let's see if we can get a better sound out of this. About 44 Hz is good, and let's play with the modulation a little bit more. .65 is pretty nice. Now we'll increase the resonance to about 42. And now we're going to move on to the effects. The first effect is going to be a Hyperdimension, and we're going to decrease the mix to about 25. And we're not going to play with any of the other controls on the Hyper. For the dimension, we're going to set the size to about 11, and the mix to about 45. Now let's move on to the distortion. We're going to use a Diode 2, and let's play with the drive and see if we get a good sound. .37 should work. It sounds a little too distorted and crunchy right now, but we're going to fix that with more effects. Let's add on a flanger. We're going to decrease the rate, so we're not going to be modulating it by a random BPM or speed. We'll be modulating it by the LFO, and we'll have more control over the way it sounds. We're going to take our LFO1 and put it on the depth, and we're going to put the depth on about 51%. And we're going to modulate it by about 23. Now let's turn on a phaser, We're going to do the same thing that we did with the flanger on the phaser by turning the rate down so we'll have full control of the sound. And we're also going to put the depth down. Now let's take the frequency and apply an LFO1 to it, and let's see what kind of sound we get. We put on about 232 Hertz. And let's modulate it by about 47. That's really nice. Now we're going to fire up an EQ. We're going to select a peak. And we're going to turn the gain up to about 9.4 decibels. Now let's take our LFO1 and modulate the frequency with it. And let's see if we get a good sound. About 113 Hertz seems good. And let's see if we can get some better modulation on it. I like it on 32. And for our last effect inside Serum, we're going to get a compressor, and let's move it to be after the EQ. We're going to make it a multiband compressor, and let's see if we get a good sound out of the gain. Somewhere about 13.6 decibels. And let's move the threshold to about minus 16.7 decibels. Nice. Before we move on to the external effects, we're going to want to tweak the pitch bend. Let's set the first pitch to be about 8 semitones, and we'll set the bottom pitch to be about 13. I chose these numbers kind of at random, and you can tweak with them depending on what kind of patterns you want to make for your songs. Now whenever we move the pitch bend wheel, it'll have a much greater effect. That's a big part of this sound, is very heavy pitch modulation. Now we're going to move on to the external effects. The first one we're going to add is a vocoder, and we're going to set it to be a modulator. We're going to set the number of bands to 40, and we're going to put the release at about 29.5 milliseconds. And that's about it for the vocoder. You can play with the format if you want, but I found it doesn't really work for this sound. It seems to work better for more traditional dubstep growls. Now we're going to get an external phaser, and this is where a big part of the sound happens, is modulating the phaser manually like we already did in Serum. It doesn't really matter where we put the frequency beforehand, but I guess we'll put it somewhere around 400 or 500. We're going to take the number of poles and increase it to 8. We're going to take the color and decrease it to 0. And let's play with the dry wet and see if we get a good sound. Somewhere around 66. And let's increase the feedback to be about 0.85. Now I'm going to delete this MIDI clip I already have, and I'm going to create a new MIDI clip to show you what I'm talking about with modulating the phaser. So we're going to right click, insert new MIDI clip, and I'm just going to put some random notes. Doesn't really matter because we're going to be modulating the pitch too. Just a very basic pattern like that works. And we'll mute the drums so we only hear the bass. So this is what this pattern sounds like without any modulation. It's a little plain, so we're going to take the frequency of the phaser, and we're going to make a lot of curves with it to modulate it and create a really interesting sound. I like to do a lot of curves that go up and then back down, like these. You're going to want to get very creative with the curves that you're doing. Don't just do the same ones over and over again. Try to look at the frequencies that you're hitting and try to vary from that. Now this is what we have. Not a huge difference, but you can definitely tell the sound has a lot more squelch to it. And now we're going to go into our pitch bend, and we're going to just do some random pitch modulations. Again, I like to do up and then down very heavily like we did with the phaser. And now it sounds like this. You could get that to sound a lot better because I just did that at random, but that's just an example to show you what you can do. We still have some more external effects to add. Next, we're going to add a Multiband Dynamics, and we're going to set it to the OTT preset. And this preset already sounds pretty good, but we're going to tweak it further to match the sound better. We're going to set the high output to be at about 10.6 decibels. The mid output can stay the same, and the low can be set to 16.3 decibels. And we're going to play with the output and see if we get a good sound. We'll leave it at 8.10. Now we're going to get a reverb. Some people might think it's odd that we're putting reverb on a bass, but because this is a very special bass, it actually matches the sound very well. On basses, you don't want a lot of low-end reverb because it'll muddy up the sound, so we're going to turn on low cut and leave high cut on, and we're going to create a very narrow curve, something kind of like this, with more emphasis on the high range. Now let's play with the decay and see if we get a sound we like. I don't want to go too big. We'll just leave it at 1.22 seconds. We're going to set the dry wet to about 21, and we'll turn the chorus off because it doesn't really do anything for this sound. You might want to increase that curve just a little bit more. I like that a lot. Now we're going to put out an EQ8. And this is going to help the sound a lot, as there's a lot of very muddy frequencies going on right now, and we're going to fix that. If you don't EQ a lot of your sounds heavily, this might be a little bit hard to follow, so feel free to pause the video at any time and try to take my directions slowly and carefully. We're going to start with band 1, which is going to be a 4 times low cut, and we're going to cut out a lot of the bass, because chances are if we're using this in an actual song, we're going to have a separate sub bass. We'll cut it off to about 137 Hertz. Next, we're going to get band 3. It doesn't really matter which bands you use, but I'm just going off of the example that I did. And we're going to keep it on this default one. And we're going to set the frequency to about minus 15 decibels. And we're going to put the quantize at 1.29. One thing I forgot with this first EQ band is we're going to want to set the quantize to about 1.15. Now we're going to take band 4, and we're going to put it at about 2.74 kilohertz, and we're going to cut out all of the gain again. Maybe a little bit less, about 14.8 should be good. And we're going to put the quantize at about 6.02. A very tight EQ curve. Now we're going to get band 6. And we're going to move this to 14.5 kilohertz. And we're going to increase this by 10 decibels because the sound's kind of dull right now and we need some higher frequencies. Now let's play with the quantize and see if we get a good sound. Oh, 0.26 works well. Now we're going to get band 7. We're going to set this to 197 Hertz. And again, we're going to cut all of it out with a minus 15 decibel gain. If you're having trouble getting the exact frequencies down, you can click on the frequency knob and then type in the number that you want. And now we'll set the quantize to 2.59. And for our last EQ band, we're going to turn it on. We're going to set it to be this default one, and we're going to put it at 449 Hertz. Again, we're going to cut out all of the frequency by putting it at minus 15 decibels. And we're going to set the quantize to about 4.62. And our sound is almost done. We only have one more effect to add, and this is actually a third-party plugin. But don't worry, this is a completely free plugin, and it works on both Windows and Mac, and it's called Clip Shifter. We're just going to leave the default settings on. We're not going to tweak anything, because having it on and not even tweaking any of the settings gives it more of a beefy and compressed sound, which works really well. And there we have our bass. So that was my tutorial. I hope you enjoyed it. Please like this video and leave a comment, as it really helps us out. And please subscribe to our channel if you haven't already.